Welcome back to Rooted in Our Ancestors' Dreams, the show where we dig deep into the past to understand our present and reimagine our future. I'm Cara, your host. Today's guest is Roberto Carlos Martinez of the Multicultural Career Center located in Virginia. He is a licensed clinical professional counselor and he is licensed in 5 states. Welcome, Roberto.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can you tell us about yourself and your journey to becoming a counselor?
Well, for me, I was born in Central America, so I'm born in El Salvador, and I came to the U.S. when I was almost 9 years old. And so, what it is, when it comes to like when I went to college, I remember originally I wanted to major in communications, and then when I started community college, it kind of changed to that I wanted to major in psychology, and then it kind of shifted from my master's to counseling. And so I love working with people and just that mental health aspect of like thinking of what are ways that we can improve our life. And for me, I was always the kid that when I was a kid, I was always like, for example, like there would be, people who were older than me, like seniors, and I would be that kid that if they were sitting on a bench, I would sit next to them and just have a conversation. And I remember that initially, when I went to get my master's, that was one of my goals to work with seniors. And what happened was at that time, seniors, were not like LPCs, so licensed professional counselors could not take Medicare, and that was part of the challenge with that. So that's why I that didn't become my primary population.
Okay, that's must have been a quite a journey to get to where you are. Um, what made you want to work with seniors? Because I know that is a difficult population to work with, and like you said, which depends on what route you go, social work, psychologist, counselor. It could be quite difficult to work with that population because of the Medicare or other insurance issues.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that attracted me was that I always had a connection with people who were older than me, and also that aspect of like I think when we think of seniors, here in the U.S., they face a lot of challenges, and I think that aspect of like for example, when we think of the difference between like collectivistic and individualistic, when for example, like a lot of a lot of for example like a lot of when we think of the majority of people around the world, and we think of of the majority being people of color, there's a lot of collectivism, which is like a lot of times there's this like this aspect of like taking care of our the people of our elders and the people who have done a lot for us, and that includes like family, like your grandparents, your great grandparents, if they're still alive, and just like the way we view the elderly community and the senior community is very different. And I think for me that was
Yes.
part of it, because when I think of individualistic, it's very different, and for example, when we think of the nuclear family here in the US, and and not to say that they don't take care of their seniors here in the US, but it's very different.
Yes, yes. A lot of times you do see, I guess it depends again on what community you identify with, but if you're looking at communities of color, you might see that we try to keep our family closer to us rather than placing them in nursing homes. And we take on a lot of caretaking roles and multiple roles to keep that family together. So yeah, there is that difference. Were there any obstacles you faced in becoming a counselor, or you know, just coming from one country to another, the migration experience? Was there any difficulty you faced in acclimating to the United States or a different culture?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges was that aspect of my parents. They came to the U.S. undocumented. Like when they originally came to the U.S., they were undocumented, and one of the reasons that I was left in El Salvador, for most of my childhood was because my mother was coming, undocumented to the U.S. And one of the things, when people, when they have to, like kind of like immigrate, a lot of times they have to think about their children and their children's safety. And one of her fears was that, how can you cross the border with a baby, because I was 9 months old when she came over.
Wow,
Yeah.
that must have been a very scary decision for her to make, but I'm sure she knew it would hopefully lead to a better situation for you all.
Yeah, and that's part of why, like thinking about that, for me, it's really like that aspect of like sometimes people don't understand the immigrant experience. And sometimes we have to think about that, when we think of like being empathetic with other communities, it's like, like they don't do things just because, they want to. Sometimes it's like the situations that happen, kind of like force families to do certain things. Like, like for example, I always tell people that I'm like, yeah, in the ideal world, I would have loved to grow up in El Salvador and have, like a career there and go to a university and all of those things. But it's like, for example, like in El Salvador, like a lot of times, like the people that go to universities, are people who have money, you know. And my family, we didn't come from money, and so I could never be in El Salvador and go to college, that wasn't a possibility. And then, my parents, that aspect of like, to have a better standard of living, that's what they had to do. And it's kind of like you don't want to separate the family, but sometimes you don't have any other choice, like my mother, I remember when I came here, one of the things she talked about, was about like, my younger brother who was born here and how like she would have loved to have, like her mother here in the US and to be able to have her mother for childcare, and how
Yeah,
that's not an option when you separate the family.
absolutely. On our last podcast, we spoke about, defining the American dream, and one of the points we touched upon was that, it's not that we necessarily think that America is the best, but sometimes it's better than the choice we had. And sometimes the impact that we want to make, we can't necessarily afford to do it in our own countries. So sometimes you have to make that difficult decision to migrate somewhere else so you can get those tools and maybe you can enact that change if you decide to go back. So it's not an easy route at all. I'm sure most people would love to stay where they are and be able to have those same freedoms and those same opportunities.
Yeah.
So, what populations do you serve right now?
Well, it's interesting, because, like I was saying that, my parents came here undocumented, and they were able to, to like, like fix their situation.
Hmm.
And then I came here to the U.S., with a visa, thanks to my parents. And, the population that I serve, like my private practice, the Multicultural Career Center is, a lot of the bases around it is, making, like making therapy affordable, So we do have like a sliding scale and we do take insurance. And a lot of the work that I do is with, it's interesting, because I have a very diverse clientele, and so there's always, part of me, that's close to my community, especially like the immigrant communities, because that story of of trying to get new opportunities and trying to improve your life and survival, that's still going on today. My dad came in the 70s, my mom came in the 80s, and now 2025 the same thing is happening where people have to do certain things to improve their life. And like I work a lot, also with like the LGBTQ plus community, people of color in general. But I think, what it comes down to is I think that, as a whole, we're all facing certain challenges. And I think, like when it comes to like people, seeking therapy, that's what it comes down to. Like, is it something, that I have experience with, in the training? And so I have insurance clients. I have clients who are not insured. I have self pay, sliding scales. So it varies. And, even the career aspect of it, the reason, like the dream of having like a career center, like a multicultural career center, was something that, I thought about for years. And part of it is thinking of like, when we think of communities of color, sometimes they come, to get help for something that's related. For example, like career related, like they're like, oh, I'm trying to change my career. I'm trying to find a job. And then you find out, that a lot of that is related to other things, stressors that are going on in their life. And they may be, like mental health related, you know? And even when I
Yeah.
think, like my experience working, for example, with like, I used to work at a substance use rehabilitation center, and thinking of, like how, so many things are connected to the issues we face in our life. It's never like a one thing. It's always like, like for example, when we think of like a person that has a mental health issue and like a substance use issue, it's like, well, which one came first? And sometimes we don't know.
Yeah, sometimes you have to flush it out and look at what are the other aggravating factors or the environments that kind of lend itself to that.
Yeah.
So, with the population you serve and with it being mental health, we know that, historically, communities of color have not been so trusting of systems that includes mental health, medical, public assistance, and that kind of thing. So, is it difficult to engage this population with therapy, or do they come distrustful, or are they more apt to open up because they see representation within your agency?
I think what it is, that aspect of, when we talk about like being culturally competent.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we talk about being culturally competent, it's not just like being part of, of a certain group or a certain, culture community, but also that aspect of like being able to understand, the culture and how people approach it. Like, for example, like in Spanish, we have, the use of usted, which, usted is a formal way of talking to someone. Usually it's like related to someone that's older than you, or kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
someone you respect. And so in English, we use you for everything. It's like you use you with your teacher, you use you with your, like if you go to church with your pastor, like things like that. It's a normal thing. But, in Spanish, a lot of times we use usted, which shows, a level of respect. And for example, like in the Spanish speaking community, a lot of times if someone's older, they expect you to use usted, because that's showing respect, because if you use you, it's kind of like they don't feel, that you acknowledge that. And sometimes, I know that, there are some Spanish speaking, people in the field who, who sometimes don't use that in the beginning, and it kind of like disconnects with the client. And just, I think that aspect of like that psychoeducation of letting people know what therapy really is, and kind of like, like normalizing mental health, that, like for example, like that aspect of, when we were growing up, there's certain language that we use that in reality, when we look back, we're like, wait a minute, that wasn't, like that a person, worried too much. Maybe it was anxiety, like a person in your
Yeah,
family. Maybe it was anxiety, and we just called it a like, oh, this person just worries a lot. And sometimes, it's related to anxiety or even like depression, when we think of depression, like there's some people, for example, that when they're depressed, they're very, like they'll be very like, they may show it as anger, or sometimes people are like, why is that person so bitter? And sometimes, it's related to anxiety or depression, knowing that, it can display in different ways, but people, sometimes they see it as one thing, but you don't know unless the person tells you, you know?
right, right.
Yeah.
So I wonder, also, what are some key, I guess, if somebody were to ask you as a counselor, what do you see the most prevalent issues facing the communities that you work with are today? What would you say they are? I'm sure that one of those would be, since you work with immigrant communities, is probably these mass deportations and the breakup of families. I'm guessing that will be quite a bit of anxiety and fear within this community.
Yeah, it's always been, a big thing, and I think, currently that fear, has been maximized. And that aspect of, like being able to, when you work with the community, letting them know that like your fear is reasonable. Like your fear is realistic,
Yeah,
And so, what I've noticed is, when working with the community, a lot of times, is being able to acknowledge that, okay, like this is a possibility, but like what is it that I can do so that that doesn't stop me from living my day-to-day life, and that's not easy.
it's not. Myself, I'm a licensed clinical counselor or social worker. So I work with a lot of individuals who identify as LGBTQ. I have some people from the African diaspora. I also have a lot of Latin Americans. And those are their biggest fears, but they kind of overcome some of those and want to get involved in the protests. And although I admire that, sometimes I have to bring my fear in, but also caution them against being out there because it's so scary. And I don't want to put them in harm's way. I want them to advocate for themselves and their communities, but I also don't want them to be hurt. But I want their voices to be heard.
Yeah, and it's tough, yeah, and it's tough, because in that sense of, like a lot of them, are, pretty much like they're trying to, like when there's for example, like safety issues in their home country,
Yeah,
and so it's kind of like they fled because, sometimes they fear for their life,
yeah,
whether it's, like they've been, like victims of crime, or, for example, like some clients, that identify as LGBTQ plus, and that aspect of like sometimes it's not safe, and and then they come here to the U.S. and that aspect of they may not feel safe here either. So it's really it puts them in this weird dilemma of like, well, where do I find safety and security?
yeah, yeah. And it's good that they do have. I love seeing the representation, especially in this area of the, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, where it's such a multicultural community. Like you see it everywhere, and you see representation everywhere. So I love that you are able to reach out to this community and be able to provide that sense of safety and kind of community with them so that they can, have that level of security.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in doing this work, what would you say is most important for people to understand about the community that you work with?
I would say like some of the most important things to understand is, like having that empathy, like I think, that's so important to have that empathy and to be able to understand, like, for example, when I think of like, of like people who immigrate here, and it's kind of like, sometimes thinking of like, we talk about, okay, for example, like, like here in the US, we hear a lot about like the children, we need to do this for the children. The children are in danger of this or that. It's like we can relate to that, but it's like, how do we struggle sometimes to relate to what would I do in order for my children to survive? Like leaving, everything that I know in my home country in order for my children to survive. And being able to empathize with things, that
Mm,
are very, like when you think about it, it's like it's very reasonable. And I think that aspect of, also with the community is that aspect of like, that there are cultural things that are different, even like, like the at that aspect of like time, sometimes we talk about how, like some group of people are very big on, like being on time and knowing that, our community, it's kind of like sometimes we have to have wiggle room for other things that are going on in their life, like for example, like when I work, for example, like I work with clients, who, for example, are like parents and be able to understand that sometimes they have emergencies or sometimes, like something happens where like they have a doctor's appointment all of a sudden, or they forgot something, and being able to have that that flexibility. And I think that's what it is. And like understanding that with any client that you work with, it's like there's gonna be setbacks, and being okay with that, that things don't always have to be like so strict. So it's like we can create boundaries, and we can create like standards, but it's like, okay, are we, can our standards be so high that we're excluding certain people, you know
yeah, yeah. How has your understanding of where you've come from, what your parents have sacrificed, how has that shaped the way that you see yourself in the world and how you see your community?
well, I would say like like the way that I see my community, is very different, in the way of, like I grew up in, in Latin America. So
Hmm.
one of the things I think about is, like, for example, when I think, of, growing up in Latin America, it's like that aspect of like, you can have so little and still appreciate life.
Yeah,
And sometimes I remind myself of that, like I don't have to have, I don't have to have like the most or the best in order to appreciate life. And so for me, I go back to that, to the people that that were around when I was growing up, like my parents, my grandparents, and how they were able to find a level of happiness even though they didn't have a lot.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and sometimes going back to to that aspect of like gratitude.
yeah, yeah. How do you think we as individuals and communities can continue to expand on the dreams that our families and ancestors have had?
Well, I feel like for me that's something that continues, because the thing is, like I
Hmm.
was reading, for example, I was reading like a little meme thing the other day where where it talked about how like some of us, it's like we are the dream that our ancestors had. Like they wished and
Yeah,
and they prayed for certain things, and it's like we're the dream that they prayed for. And thinking of that, like our ancestors, and and what we do to kind of like not only move the family along, but also like move our communities along.
Absolutely.
I remind clients, for example, like when clients are immigrants, whether they're from Latin America or they're from other parts of the world. And
Yeah.
sometimes, for example, like they're like, I came here, for my kids, to have better opportunities. Sometimes I remind them that I'm like, do you realize that, like your child is in the position where I was when I was a child? Like your child, because they see it so far away. There, to them, it's kind of like, okay, I'm working with a therapist who's so far away I'm so far away from touching them, like in a professional way. When in reality, I remind them that it's like your child could be where I am, you know like that is a possibility. Like if that's something they want, you can support them, and you can, connect them to those resources, and they can make that dream, a
Yeah.
reality. They want to be a therapist, mental health therapist, or they want to, have their own business, or they want to, be a CPA, or be, whatever they want to be, and be able to have them understand that that's not as far away from them as they think, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I do thank you for taking the time to, come on our podcast as a guest. And I really enjoyed our conversation. And if you could tell us a little bit about how to get in contact with you, where people can, you know, um, obtain your services or learn more about the Multicultural Career Center.
Yeah, so our website is multiculturalcareercenter.com, and we're a telehealth based practice. And the way it works, is like you can go to the website, and on there, you can go ahead and contact us, and then also, our phone number. It's 571-350-3779, and our email is info at multiculturalcareercenter.com. And the thing is, like I'm licensed, in Virginia, D.C., Maryland, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. So I work with clients in those different states.
That is good to know. And are you the only one in are there other counselors within your center, or
Yes, we
are
do
you
have we do
the,
have another therapist, and then we also have like a counselor assistant. And so, I think in the future, we're gonna keep growing. And the thing is, like just we love what we do. I think that's what it is we love what we do, and that aspect of like helping the community. And I think always like staying close to to that aspect of like when we think of like social justice, and and being able to help people get those resources that they need.
I love that. I do love that. But thank you again for joining us. And listeners, you can find Roberto's information at the end of our podcast within the summary. But thank you for joining us for another episode of Rooted in Our Ancestors' Streams. If you've enjoyed this conversation, share it with a friend, leave us a review, and tell us about your story and how mental health has helped you, how representation and counseling in mental health has helped you. And until next time, keep dreaming, keep building, and keep it rooted. Thank you.